Good afternoon, everyone. I won't keep you very long from lunch and the next talk. So, thank you, Srini Rajgopal, for remembering me and calling me for this conference. I have been asked to speak on neuromonitoring and neuroprotection in patients with acute liver failure in the perioperative period. So, and so I want to just go over the facts. Like we all know what acute liver failure is. Disease which suddenly strikes a person without any background of a liver disease, and there is coagulopathy, encephalopathy, and all this is reversible, and all this is potentially reversible. And there are so many definitions from different groups. We following the INASIL definition. There are different etiologies, and with viral predominating in India, and now we have rat poison coming from the south, and we do not have so much of paracetamol, but we have a lot of viral and hepatitis A emerging from hepatitis E. So, and this affecting the entire systems, all the organ systems. But if you ask me what is it that kills them and what is it that is predominantly responsible for poor outcomes, is cerebral edema. And if we can monitor our patients and pitch in at the right time, taking all the conservative measures which are required, then maybe we can manage a lot of patients with conservative management as well. So as per the Western literature from Europe as well as from the US, the incidence of cerebral edema is coming down quite a bit. But in our practice, we have seen that in each case, cerebral edema needs to be worked upon. We need to monitor it, we need to take care of it, and we need to avoid it, whether we are taking up this patient for transplant or we are not. So the pathogenesis for this cerebral edema is multifactorial. There is cytotoxic cerebral edema. There is a lot of ammonia contributing to it. There is vasogenic. And there are inflammatory cytokines which are also responsible for contributing. So I will quickly move to the part which is the actual talk. So we all know that as the grade of encephalopathy worsens, the edema worsens. And this has been correlated with the levels of ammonia, and there has been tremendous work in that direction. And so invasive ICP monitoring, which has literally been thrown out of the window, is the accepted gold standard. It is accurate, especially if you put a catheter into the right space. But it has so many complications. It is associated with occurrence of bleed. It's in itself, it can cause infections. So is it feasible? Perhaps not. So how do we monitor these patients? This is the data which has come again from the US group as well as the UK group, which is telling us that very few centers, even high volume centers are now very few high volume centers are using ICP monitoring invasively in patients with grade 3 and 4 encephalopathy. So today is the era of non-invasive ICP monitoring, where we have to monitor our patients in different phases. We have to do 2-3 things at the same time, and we have to see how this patient is progressing. So we have to see the pupils. We have to see how this patient behaves clinically. Is there any localizing sign? Is there any change in reflexes? Is there any change in tone? We have to rely on a lot of indirect markers. There is, arterial ammonia levels. We can see the trend. We can see the optic nerve sheath diameter. This can be clubbed with transcranial Dopplers. This can be clubbed with NIRS, which is coming up in a big way. And I would like to go to each one of them individually. So we're assessing a patient with, and we already know that the level of consciousness is gone. We have to tube this patient. So how do we assess the level of consciousness? We can maybe do a sedation based on BIS. We can assess the pupils. We can do a close monitoring, 2-hourly pupillary dilatation. We observe the patient's posture. We see for any posturing, any seizure activity. But remember, this patient doesn't have to be on muscle relaxants. Otherwise, you cannot tell whether this patient is posturing or not. Unless if you are very sure that you're taking up this patient within the next 2 hours, or you're not being able to ventilate him with the current strategies, you do not paralyze these patients. We used this indirect pupillometer, which was an objective way to remove the subjective variations of pupillary dilatation. We have to see pupil reaction, we have to see pupil size, maybe every hour in these patients. So this particular instrument helps us by giving us the NPI index, which if less than 3 is a problem. So the ambiguity of subjectiveness is obliterated when you're observing the pupils in the patient. So anybody can, as the posting changes, the doctor changes, the nurse changes, you can use the pupillometer to assess for pupillary reaction. But even if the pupils are dilated and fixed, this is our experience from my previous center, where it is seen that these patients can be safely taken up for transplant, because it is important that the pupils should be dilated and fixed for a prolonged period of time. It is not like, it happens and the patient has herniated. So you can do a series of other tests, and you can also remember that although the blood-brain barrier is maintained in these patients, there are situations where you will get pupillary dilatation and fixation and maybe asymmetry, but you do not sign off on these patients just because of that. So the other way of looking at it is looking at things indirectly. So we can do a fundus examination. But again, fundus examinations give you a picture which is very much delayed. So if it has been seen that when you do a CT scan and if you do a fundus examination, the fundus may not show you that much papilledema as the CT scan was showing you, with obliteration of sulci and the ventricles all gone in this particular scan. So the better way of doing things is, when you are managing these patients, is to use a combination of techniques, like I said before. And optic nerve sheath diameter is something which is very practical and very useful and very doable, where on the bedside you put a probe on the closed eyelid and you get a window, and 3 mm behind the disc you can measure the diameter, and this can be serially measured. Now there was a meta-analysis and they gave us the cutoff. So you have to know exactly how much is the ICP, is it correlating with ICP? So they gave us cutoffs of 5.6. So basically, if it was between 4.8 and 5.6, then your patient has, not that kind of a cerebral edema that he's herniating. But I, from my experience, would say, and I would agree with this paper from ILBS, where they have said that 4.6 is actually the target. You do not go to levels of 5 and 5.5 and beyond, and look at the trends. If you look at the trends, it gives you more information. Whether the patient is progressing, when do you need to intervene? Because when you talk about neuroprotection, you have to intervene as and when necessary, when the pupil diameter is increasing. The other thing which we can use, and we have baseline data on transcranial Doppler, and Dr. Sushma has worked a lot on this, and she has given us 4 images. You can make a window, a transtemporal window, and through that you can see the flow in the middle cerebral artery. The probes that are available to us nowadays and the software which is available to us nowadays is very simple. And the operator training part, which was considered very tough, is now over. And this technique can be used again for serial monitoring. But you can see things like the flow, you can see the systolic and diastolic flow in the middle cerebral artery, and you can also see the PI and resistive index, and there are normal ranges, and you can monitor and see which way the patient is going and intervene as and when necessary. There is reversal of flow which can be seen, there can be vasospasm which can be seen. So this technique is also something which can be clubbed along with ONST, and the patient cerebral status can be monitored better once he has been tubed. Another thing which we have used in the past is jugular oximetry for seeing the saturation of jugular venous oxygen, the bulb oxygen. So you can do a direct puncture, and in the past we used to have a catheter which could be inserted, and just like a pulmonary artery catheter, this catheter is advanced into the jugular bulb like a central line, and using a fiber optic device, it was possible to take continuous measurements. But unfortunately, this catheter is no longer available. So I believe instead of fiber optic oximetry, we are only left with intermittent puncturing now. So if the catheter should be available in the market again, because there was a catheter from Edwards which was available, I think by the name of Precep, which helped us to do this more serially and continuously. You can see how much, this is an indirect assessment of how much oxygen is being used up by the brain and how much is being delivered. So if you see the value of saturation of jugular venous oxygen, you can see whether it is less than 60 or more than 80. If it is less than 60, perhaps the brain is using up more. Maybe there is some seizure activity, or that the blood flow is not enough. So you can optimize that. And if the SjVO2 is rising and it has gone beyond 80%, probably you need to reduce the metabolic activity in the brain. You can try to give some hypothermia or hyperventilate the patient. So this was an indirect marker, but this was a useful marker. But instead of that, now we have this new tool, which is near-infrared spectroscopy, which is here and it has been here for a long time, but has been used in acute liver failure. And we really need to work on this technique, because this has been used in trauma, and there are studies which are being done in normal people to show the changes. So I'd like to dwell a little on this. So here again, you just place an electrode on the forehead, and there are two light emitting diodes, and there is a receptor, and it measures the differential absorption of light which is thrown on the, so it traverses the hemoglobin and the oxygenated hemoglobin. Near infrared spectrum light is used, so there have been studies with 810 nanometer wavelength light mostly. So just like saturation of jugular venous oxygenation, here again you're seeing the value through brain metabolism, how much is the blood supply, how much is the oxygen, and how much is the uptake. So again, it's sort of indirect, but it helps tell you whether, but it's much more doable than putting a line into the jugular bulb. So it's a simple technique where you put in a probe on the forehead and you see whether the oxygen delivery should be optimized or consumption should be reduced. And similarly, you can improve the blood flow, or you can cool down the patient or reduce the metabolic demand, run infusions which can reduce the metabolic activity in the brain, and measures to reduce the ICP, because these are indirect markers, but they're useful and sustainable over a long period of time. And this was earlier said that, when they tried to measure ICP in a patient with traumatic brain injury and corroborate it with near-infrared spectroscopy, they said it was not good enough. They said it is not a substitute of CT imaging. But here we're not wanting to see CT imaging. Here we are wanting to see whether this patient is progressing towards intracranial hypertension. So NIRS might be the way forward, because in this study, which has come from a physiology lab, they have tried to, they've done it in a small subset, about 16, 17 volunteers. They did not put in a bolt, but they did things which are known and which have been proven that this causes alteration in intracranial pressures, like Valsalva, like Trendelenburg, and they have seen whether it is corroborating with NIRS measurements. So a huge number of measurements were taken, and they feel that it does corroborate. So I think this is the way forward in neuromonitoring in liver failure patients. Then, of course, we can see the EEG, but how many times would you do an EEG to see subclinical seizure activity? But we do need to see it if we want to confirm, because here we have a patient who's been tubed, who's been paralyzed, who's on ventilator, and you really can't rely on anything except ONSD and arterial ammonias. So you can do an EEG to see whether there are any subclinical seizure activities. So using a combination of these, depending on what all you're using, you can use a pupillometer to remove subjective variability in assessment of pupils. You can combine it with an ONSD. You can also have a TCD done every 4 hours or so. And so a combination of these techniques, arterial ammonia, this can help you titrate your management and decide what you need to do. So coming to neuroprotection. Now, like I said before, ammonia was the key reason for this raised ICP. So we need to address that. And anti-inflammatory action needs to be taken, because there are a lot of inflammatory mediators which also contribute to cerebral edema, the cytotoxic part. We need to reduce the metabolism in the brain, and we also can optimize the hemodynamics so that there is adequate flow to the brain, and prevent sepsis at the same time, because again, that will cause inflammation. So in ammonia lowering, we do not have too much in the form of medical management, because LOLA really doesn't work. There is a new drug which is being investigated. This is ornithine phenylacetate, which is in phase 3 clinical trials in humans right now, which works similarly, but has more promising effects seen in animals in reduction of cerebral edema. Then sodium benzoate, which was for urea cycle defects. You could use it, but it more or less doesn't work. And of course, you can try to filter the patient. So this was the trial on Lola, which I anyway says that it has been done and it has been shown that it does not help in reducing cerebral edema. But CRRT, which came in with management of urea cycle disorders in children, has been one modality which can be used if you're relying on ammonia levels, if you're looking that you're having a patient with 400, 600, then low dose, high dose, there have been consistent studies, but this is from King's, this came in 2008, that there is gradual improvement in arterial ammonia as CRRT continues. And as the flow rates improve, in low flow rates, the effects might be slower to come. This was a paper from Andy, and I had the privilege of witnessing this work happening. I had an opportunity to visit. So there was low flow CRRT and there was high flow CRRT, and high flow CRRT helped in filtering the ammonia slightly better. And we have more, this was a meta-analysis. No, this was a study which was from the USALF group, where they had few patients, 200 odd patients who were not filtered, but the rest, thousands, 800, 900 patients were filtered. And they clearly showed that there was improvement in ammonia levels with filtration. So in children, it has been seen that it really works. Clinically, you have seen children having improvement in their consciousness when they were filtered for ammonia with using CRRT high flows. So there is ample evidence to say that CRRT works. What else can we do? We can maintain the sodium levels. We can there has been this paper where they, they monitored the patients with help of ONSD and with the help of and the clinical effects, and they found that use of hypertonic saline was more helpful in management of edema as compared to mannitol. So we tend to use mannitol, we tend to use hyperventilation because brain autoregulation is maintained. But we use these as salvage, SOS. When you know that there is some Cushing's triad, or you know that this patient you're suspecting that this patient is having raised pressure, you tend to pitch in with hyperventilation or with mannitol. But maintaining sodium levels, where hypertonic saline also tends to help you maintain the sodium levels because this is 3% normal saline. So it helps in reducing cerebral edema. Of course, you need to tube the patient. You need to nurse him in a quiet environment. You do not allow neck engorgement. Do not allow the brain to get overperfused. So you do not put lines in a position where the head is down, as we say, Trendelenburg position. And when the ventilation strategy, if there is no ARDS, then things are simplified for you. Otherwise, it can be total chaos. Low tidal volumes, low PEEP, low pressures, and hyperventilation to target a PCO2. Because the brain has maintenance of blood-brain barrier, and there is maintenance of autoregulation. So washing out of carbon dioxide has always helped. And as I said, I do not believe in paralyzing patients unless and until they're being shifted for a transplant. And hypothermia. So there is, again, so much of literature which tells you that there is no point in really freezing them, but moderate hypothermia. So there is paper from Karavelas where he has clearly shown us that 35 degrees or max 35 is what we are targeting. We do not really cool the patients down too much to reduce the metabolic requirement. And then coming to Plex, which suddenly in 2017 we were all filtering our patients using plasmapheresis because of this trial by Larson, which said that high volume exchanges were helping. But whether it were directly helping in reducing cerebral edema or whether they were helping in reduction, I really do not know, because this data, in spite of being around for a long period of time, most of us were not able to convert our patients using high volume plasmapheresis. So plasmapheresis does help in removing inflammatory cytokines. This paper by Marzaki from ILBS, where they, and in a lot of other centers also, especially in rat poison, it has been used. Every patient cannot be transplanted, even if we want. there are many limitations. So patients are filtered. But does it really reduce cerebral edema? I don't know. Well, high volume plasmapheresis did not work in our setups. The patients were not hemodynamically stable enough. They succumbed to sepsis. So standard volume plasma exchange was offered to them. And when we're not using a dialysis machine, when we're not using centrifugal plasmapheresis, we're anyways doing standard volume plasma exchanges. So standard volume plasma exchanges have also shown to be beneficial in certain trials. I thought I should also share this. This is our work from Max, where all the patients whom we offered standard medical therapy versus those who were given CRRT versus those who were plexed, we found that the outcomes were better in those who were offered standard medical therapy rather than being filtered or plasmapheresis. And we had the maximum survival in this group. So this is this work which we have done in the last 8.5 years at Max in acute liver failure patients. So I think that since cerebral edema is the major killer, if sepsis doesn't set in, then the way forward is to nurse these patients in a quiet environment, secure the airway when you need to, ventilate with an ARDS strategy, maintain moderate hypothermia, offer them some ammonia lowering therapy in the form of filtration. If the patient is having involvement of the kidney, it becomes a simpler choice, and target sodium levels at a higher level, offer NAC, although it helps better in paracetamol, which we do not see, and monitor them, monitor aggressively, so that you can pitch in with hyperventilation, with mannitol as and when required. So close neuromonitoring, I would say, is very, very crucial, so that you can detect and you can timely manage an intervention if needed. And monitoring needs to be done with multimodal therapies. There is no one tool which can be used alone. And we need to look at serial values. So I would like to conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. As an intensivist, I want to tell only this thing, ma'am. Yes, ONSD is little bit subjective. Because if I am measuring ONSD and he is measuring OSD, maybe little bit different as USCL, but the TCD definitely will give the better outcome. And we are doing one more thing is a Lindegard ratio, ma'am. Just if we are doing the MCA velocity, divide by the extracranial intercoronary artery, and we are giving the mannitol or the 3% NS, after that just see the velocity, it will reduce. So you mean to say you are diagnostic also, you are therapeutic also. By giving the 3% saline or the mannitol, you can see the ICP is coming down. And many studies published, they are saying that ONSD multiplied by 5 minus 14 roughly will give the ICP also. And NURS, I think, is not very well evaluated in the ALF patient. But yeah, we need to monitor regularly or routinely all the neural, because that patient died in the ALF because of the cerebral edema. So the last slide, yours, everything you are telling, everything to manage the how to the high ICP patient, because the monitoring and the management, that is the only important patient in ALF. Any question from audience? Sir, CRRT, I am in the AIG, sir. So if you will say that I am receiving roughly 80 CRRT, sir. So, second question, how do you ensure that your circuit, which is expensive, don't have prostatectomy? How do you do with that? I have a big problem using CRRT in patients with normal functions, no matter what they do to the ammonia. That is true, sir, because many patients, but in the ALF patient, very unlikely you will find some normal ammonia. Yeah, those patients are going.
Yeah, so when the patient has AKI along with ALF, so it becomes an easier choice that you are needing to do CRRT. But if you do not have a patient with renal dysfunction, then we can use citrate for anticoagulation.
Sir, there is a many benefit with the CRRT, sir. Sir, there is a many benefit with the CRRT. First benefit, it will consistently remove the ammonia. Secondly, metabolic disturbance. Third is the temperature control. The CRRT may manage in better way as compared to the plasma exchange in many way in the ALF patients.
Sir, actually it is both ammonia as well as the inflammatory mediators that is causing the damage. So in CRRT, it is already many studies have shown that CRRT improves the damage of other organs. So that is how we are improving and preventing one modality to prevent the patient going into transplant as such. So that way, definitely CRRT would be beneficial in preventing the other organ dysfunction in ALF patients.
For the anticoagulation, apart from heparin, there is an option of citrate anticoagulation.
Regional
which
citrate.
With the calcium goes down and it requires very intensive monitoring and management.
But sir, normal creatinine level doesn't mean to say the patient, our job is right now to remove the ammonia level because the edema is there. Even though, because now we are receiving the patient of viral hepatitis, which is the most commonly AE that is.
Unless the patient is getting deteriorated, I think usually CRRT is not started.
That's a separate matter.
Yeah, so that is why I shared our paper from our previous 8.5 years of experience, where we do not filter or we do not start CRRT on every patient, but our results have been good. And 50% of our patients were in the standard medical therapy group, and those patients had a better outcome as compared to those who were filtered or put on flex for whatever reason. So this is our paper, which will hopefully get published soon.